Thanks for listening to the Scottish Housing Podcast. You can find out more about the presenters by going to scottishhousingpod.com, and you can also follow us on social media. We are on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok and Facebook. Just look up at Scottish Housing Pod. So Stephen and I are now joined by Chris Dougray. People in the commercial sector will know you, Chris, but for those who don't, do you want to introduce yourself, say who you are and why you're on a property podcast?
Thank you both for having me this morning. Chris Dougray. I graduated from Paisley Tech, as it was then, in 1988. So I've been doing it a while in the commercial property sector. And now I'm employed by CBRE, having sold my business to them about almost 3 years ago now. And I'm here because I guess I've got something to say about the world in which we work and live, in Scotland particularly. CBRE, of course, or I say of course, you may not know, are a global business, so there's an interesting sort of global perspective to what we do. But delighted to be here and look forward to a chat. Thank you again.
You must have seen a lot of changes then in the time you've been in property since 1988.
Yeah, yes and no. Fundamentally, and I do remain of the belief that it remains quite a people business. Mm-hmm. Not every aspect of it is relationship driven, but a lot of it remains that way, which I think is a good thing. I guess the big changes I've seen, I mean, I remember pen and paper and faxes. That's how old I am. Now AI is creeping in. That is going to have a massive impact. I think all of us probably know it's going to have a massive impact. We're not probably sure exactly what, but it feels that that's going to happen, and certainly it's creeping in on a day-to-day basis in CBRE already. Mm-hmm. We have access to it, and colleagues are using it frequently. Yeah.
There's a lot of nervousness about AI, isn't there? The immediate fear people have is about jobs and employment, a very obvious one. And actually, I think that's another whole podcast as well about jobs, employment and AI, and about the future of our industry and other industries and growth in the country, all very topical. What do you think from the early observations, especially from such an experienced person, experience in running a business, experience in management, experience in this industry that we all have an interest in? What do you think you might be identifying as the positives that's already emerging? I suppose the obvious one that everyone knows is about efficiency, but there must be more tangibles than just efficiency that you're already seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I think any process that can be automated, I think, will be. That's where I've landed on it. I've spoken to people who are smarter than me in the AI space. Maybe I can come back and reference one of those people. Perhaps a good example, which is related to real estate, is residential conveyancing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, we all know, and any of your listeners will know, that buying and selling your flat, once you've agreed the deal and it goes to lawyers, that can still take 8 weeks.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's now a standard form of contract. You know, when I was doing it, it was a negotiation in the contractual terms. There is now in Scotland a standard form of residential contract. I could easily see that being part of an AI conversation that would reduce the time involved in that conveyancing piece to days. Mm-hmm. In fact, I'd be amazed if that doesn't happen.
It's interesting because one of the things that I'm always interested to hear these little takes, because in a macro context with the country, the UK, it has been for some time, and we're grappling again. It's a very topical political and economic debate about migration and immigration, and also skill shortages in every sector, all of these things. And yet everyone thinks that I speak to, maybe it's just whoever I speak to, AI, job threat, especially as professionals, whatever. But if automation, which has been with us for an awful long time in different forms, never really created mass unemployment and the end of everyone's future, if we could free up people who already are in employment in some shape or form through the use of AI, we can help surely bridge skill gaps elsewhere. and make it easier for governments to grapple this migration and immigration difficulty as well. Surely it's a positive contribution to make there.
I completely agree with that, but that is big thinking, and there's a lot to get around there. I think Scotland's in a really interesting position. For AI, I make a quick mental leap to data centres.
Yeah.
And Scotland is in an interesting position. We have a cool climate. That's a big point. These what they call hyperscale data centres, which are generally associated with AI, they need much more power. They throw off so much excess heat that it's important they're in a cool climate. It's important they have access to power. Scotland has a lot of power. It may not be in the right places today, but the components are there. I think the chap I was referring to earlier is Stephen Drost.
Right.
He's the co-founder of Codebase,
Right.
largest tech incubator, a scaler of small tech enterprises in the UK. Really interesting bloke, graduate of philosophy from Glasgow University. He's one of life's thinkers. So I listen to a lot of what Stephen says, and he explains that the platforms on which AI is based are owned. I don't have it in front of me. Certainly two of the five, I think 3 of the 5 are American, Google, Microsoft. There will never be another of these platforms. They cost $1 trillion to develop. He said the clever bit, no government even will develop another of these platforms. But the clever bit for Scotland is these platforms, they are the base for the companies using the technology within the platform. So if the platforms are horizontal, they live off the verticals that feed off them.
Right.
So what Scotland, we want to do is be ahead of this curve in AI and in data centres and encourage those 4 young people who spun out of Glasgow University or Edinburgh University who are creating a digital-based business around healthcare, life sciences, data sciences, to build off these platforms who use the data centre located in Scotland. There's an really interesting social economic opportunity for Scotland, but it needs people like Stephen and at the government level to get ahead of this.
I wonder if I could just pick up on that point and relate it to this at a bigger thinking about the future of where the UK collectively is going economically. Excuse me. If that's a big opportunity for Scotland, partly because of the climate and the other things you've described, and it really sounds quite exciting, I wonder if we could relate that to everyone I speak to in property and construction and housing are clearly concerned about where the Scottish position is in terms of the industry because of things like interest rates, shortage of housing emergencies, the housing bill in the Scottish Parliament, and the most common thing that people begin to say now, and I've been expressing it myself, particularly when I've been in London, is that, and with colleagues in the Scottish Parliament, is with there being such momentum, and I know some people are cynical about it, but such momentum at UK government level and in England, are we going to get left behind in terms of housing investment and housing development in Scotland? And will workers in the construction industry that have migrated here, will they end up down south? And do you get them back? All of these things I'm sure you'll be quite familiar with as well. If we were getting ahead of the curve on these data centres, and keep it, and presumably the data centres, people would be using them remotely from other parts, not just Scotland, but presumably they would keep people in Scotland as well. Would this be a little new dynamic that really helps us pull investment that some of us are worried is going to end up being focused south of the border for the reasons I've described? If all other things are equal, would that actually be helpful to the kind of mixed economy that we need and give us we all, even when we're in the one country, regionally, you always need a competitive advantage. Would it be part of the solution, do you think?
Yeah, I think it absolutely could be. I think we as a nation need to be open and progressive around this type of thing. In terms of your point about could we be left behind from the rest of UK, I mean, conceivably, yes. An observation I'd make, whether it was related to data centres and AI or other aspects of the Scottish economy, real estate economy, is, we operate in a very, in my view, a very cluttered public sector. We're a small country. Population of Scotland is roughly the same as the northwest of England. We've got 32 local authorities, quite a number of very well-meaning and proactive government agencies, Scottish Citizens Alliance, Scottish Property Network, etc., etc. At some point, I think it'd be really helpful to have some unanimity around the view. That will be hard, because the person who's anxious and keen to deliver social housing in the Highlands, the perspective may be, how do we deliver 40 units spread over 3 islands? That's a completely different perspective to, Glasgow could do with 40,000 affordable social rent units in the next 4 years. So it's not an easy thing to solve, but I think it's a good ambition. Do you mind me just continuing in this point?
No.
So I actually host my own round tables in Edinburgh, typically. We had 8 this year. Some of them are based on themes. That's some interesting ones. Space was a good one, because I knew nothing about it, but with interesting people. And sometimes it's based on individuals. And the one before last, we had a super interesting and very impressive guy up, Mike Palin, who's the Executive Director of Homes England. We had probably 20 guests in the room, the Scottish Government, quite a few of the larger councils, Scottish Futures Trust, Scottish Cities Alliance. And Mike was very generous with his time. He stayed with us from 10 in the morning till mid-afternoon. And the feedback from various people was actually quite consistent, which was the significance of a single delivery agency, Homes England. The impressiveness of the individual. Some of the chat, just to give you a couple of snippets, which really struck me. Mike says, I actually don't know how many local authorities there are in England. But he said, there's a lot.
Yeah.
But he said, I could name now only the 20 that we are prepared to work with.
That's very interesting.
And I could also name didn't actually number, everyone we will not work with. Of course, it tees beautifully up the question, what draws you to the 20? I'm just trying to reflect on a couple of the points I made. One was a vision which remains static, irrespective of political party and power. A consistency of vision. He said, councils where it's evident that policy and vision changes per party in control, he said, it isn't attractive to us. And he also said, we're drawn to local authorities where they evidently have the teams and professional capability to execute the strategy to achieve the vision. And he said, that's not every local authority. And I think that kind of, one could easily layer that over Scotland, which is not to be critical. We've got a very many high quality planning officers, for instance, but they're stretched. That's a consistent theme. And speak to parties who apply for planning consent, developers. The people they're engaged with, the planning officers, are great, but there's not enough of them. So I don't know quite how I got to that point, but
No, but that's really interesting, because as you're talking about that, I'm thinking about my own experience of dealing with the housing association sector in Scotland, and I often make the distinction between what I would refer to as the indigenous housing associations, which are the ones based here, and the larger ones that have the home group, for example, which is UK wide. And just as you were saying that, and I was relating it actually to being a small business owner, and you've been a small business owner, you're really taking a huge strategic view of your industry if you run a small business, because you're dealing with the day-to-day element of running your business.
Indeed.
And you just don't have the infrastructure for you to be completely detached That's why sometimes small business owners, any listening to this will be aware, you make some of your best decisions on holiday because you're not in the day-to-day management of your business and you get time to think. And I was thinking about all of those small individual housing associations in Scotland and the fact that we don't even, and 32 local housing, local authorities which feed into them in terms of the need for social housing. And just what you were saying there, you can see why no individual person's fault. They're all working very hard. But it's very difficult to then have one strategic overviewing voice of this is the way forward for us to tackle the 150,000 people on the housing waiting lists. If you've got all these small micromanagement activities going on across the sector. Do you think that could be part of the challenge of our social housing sector then? That it's just too fragmented, based on what your experience with the England?
That is absolutely my view.
And it shouldn't be hard for us to deal with it because we have a single entity in the sense of the Scottish Parliament. So we have our own devolved Parliament with our own ministers, who is an incredibly powerful devolved Parliament.
I agree.
That if the decisions, and I'm not making any party political point because the two main parties who are in this country, the Labour Party and the SNP, have both controlled the Parliament and ran the government. But it's difficult. So they were able to get a consensus to create this single Scottish police force. But look at the experience of the National Care Strategy and the difficult debate that Labour's begun to raise about elected mayors for Glasgow and Edinburgh. And it is tricky because you are challenging vested interests. And people fear the worst. Yeah. But in principle, it shouldn't be difficult, and we shouldn't be afraid to look at, positive experiences like hearing what Homes for England have done, and ultimately, in terms of those vested interests, if we had, if we were able to create greater capacity within the system, because that's actually what raised this question, we'd be protecting people's employment. Because you effectively would be creating more in all reality, and the knock-on effect is you'd be attracting much more investment and development into the country. What do you think? Again, I'm really interested in this because your background in journey to where you are today is been so experienced and with different types of hats as opposed to just coming through the ranks of somewhere like CBRE to where you are today. What if you were speaking to a decision maker? Because some decision makers listen to this podcast, we think they certainly claim to.
Okay.
If you were speaking to a decision maker in the context of everything we've discussed and try to make it simple for people, because when we're busy, people need simple things. What do you think the 2 or 3 key things that need to be that we need to do as a country to really maybe simplify things and create the right conditions at this kind of crossroads that as an island we're at in terms of the sector we're most interested in collectively of property and housing in particular, but suppose development industry in general?
That's a big question. Thank you, Steve.
We'll just go for a coffee while you answer that for about 5 minutes.
No pressure, but I meant it. You come with a great pedigree of experience, so
thank you.
I think your view within the country is will be a pretty informed one.
I'm happy to have the question. I'm not recoiling quite in panic, but so where to start? I'll make a point first, and then maybe lead on to that.
Sure.
I think there's been so much static around the housing bill. And I'm not, it's a matter of national legislation. We have it. I make no political point. It's there. We know it's going through a process. I guess it will take into 2026 when we start dealing with the car, if there are any exemptions.
Yeah.
That's there. But there's been so much static around it. LinkedIn is full of it. That what I think has been lost over the last 12 months is that the issue today is arithmetic, not policy. By which I mean, if the housing bill was cancelled this afternoon, There has been an expectation fueled, I have to say, by many of my contemporaries, that the seawalls are about to break. Such is the pressure from capital wanting to get into this space.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not the case.
Right.
Sorry, the principle's correct, but the money won't invest if the sums don't work, which is my point about arithmetic.
Mm-hmm.
The issue today is viability.
Mm-hmm.
The game's moved on a lot, and not in a good way. Making an appraisal work today, whether it's social rent, mid-market rent, BTR attracts, that's been the big one.
Yeah, BTR,
Billions are waiting to come into BTR. Well, they
And,
may well be.
and incidentally, sorry to interrupt,
No.
do you think that the arithmetic around viability has moved on in the period that the housing bill's been put? I'm not saying because of the housing bill, I'm not asking for a view on that, and I'm not sure I've got a view either. I just mean, has it literally...
Definitely.
So, in many ways, the housing bill has been superseded from a commercial perspective in terms of where the market is. I'm not sure that many of our contemporaries or the people I work with get that. I'm not sure I got that.
Well,
that's interesting.
I understand there is so much attention in the housing bill, and it is quite right that we, as we being the private sector, and I feed my kids from generating business related to this type of activity. Mm-hmm. It is absolutely right and proper that we get the housing bill into the best possible shape, by which I mean the most investor-friendly shape. Mm-hmm. The government have their policy. That's not what I'm commenting on. But your question, the answer to which is simple, which is yes. Interest rates were a quarter. I actually don't know this for a fact, but I think when it came out, interest rates were in the ultra-low period.
Yep.
Now they're 4.75. We all know they're unlikely to go down as fast as we hoped. Mm-hmm. Construction costs in the 2 years have increased significantly. So you've got a cost increase and a value erosion. Mm. So I'm not at all surprised at your reaction that your circle, your group, your contacts aren't talking about that, because it's not being talked about nearly enough. Mm. Making those appraisals work today is a challenge. So, in my opinion, the housing bill, as important as it is, and the challenges around it are very important, is now completely subservient to the issue of viability. Okay. So that's the first point I made. That's a big point.
Yeah, it is.
It's a really big point. I think then, leading on from that, I think we need to create a forum for there is negativity on both sides, I would say, private sector to public, public to private. I think we need to create a forum where there is an opportunity to be views to be expressed and understood. That for me is the baseline position that we move forward from there. Since I don't know when this will be published, released, whatever the expression is, we're around Christmas time.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've watched it. This week I watched The Making of Do They Know It's Christmas? BBC iPlayer.
Yeah.
It's fantastic. And one of my takeaways, I'm sorry if this is a bit kind of random, when you see those guys, that kind of semi-punky Bono, shaking hands with George Michael, talking to Tony Hadley, etc., etc. Badges came off at the door.
Yes, absolutely.
Egos came off at the door. And my kind of perhaps fanciful ambition is that we can have that moment amongst the key people in Scotland where badges and egos are left at the door, and it's like, how are we going to sort this? This is, that affordable and mid-market rent piece in Scotland, that's the national infrastructure of the country. Mm-hmm. And it's not in great state. So we need to address this. And if we're going to address it, as important as those 20 units on the Isle of Lewis, that point I was making earlier are, what we need is wholesale delivery of residential units. I mean, at the thousands level. Mm-hmm. And at the thousands level, that needs infrastructure investment. And that's expensive. Mm-hmm. These are really big numbers. The private sector can't be expected to shoulder that, and won't, is the point. So we need to get into a discussion about how are we dealing with that? Because until we get those tens of millions into those very large sites, it won't happen. As somebody said to me, in the case of Edinburgh, the 35% affordable housing policy, again, non-political view, it is what it is. But you don't need to be a graduate of Harvard to know that 35% of nothing is nothing. The point is, if the viability means that it doesn't get built, you can have whatever percentage of affordable housing you want in policy. What we want is to get the units built. Right? So there's some big issues there. But, my colleagues in CBRE are in 10 Downing Street on a regular basis just now, looking at structures for this infrastructure funding piece, which is massive. And I dare say others are as well. We need to work together to sort that if we're going to have this big release of housing. And when I say of housing, another point just I'd make is we talk about the housing crisis. It's not a housing crisis for upper middle class people. It's a housing crisis for the economically disadvantaged. Yep. And let's call a spade a spade. And if we as a nation can't quickly address how we put roofs over the heads of our economically disadvantaged citizens, well, shame on us. Because we have the best brains, smart people, world-class developers in Scotland, access to funding, clever politicians. We need to sort it.
Yeah, and on the political front, ironically, if you take the Constitution out of the question or out of the debate, the vast majority of our politicians agree on all these issues. On all of these issues. So in some shape or form, it should be easier. And it should be easier for those egos to be set aside to agree on common ground, that then they might find their surprise when they speak to the influential movers and shakers within the private sector, how much common ground there is there. And certainly for our politicians, you're absolutely spot on. When there's a pressure on the housing market, or indeed any industry, but the housing market's the one we're speaking about, the people that will be worst off soonest is those at the bottom. We already have a bigger homelessness crisis than we've ever had before, and that is directly related to the housing emergency. And you're spot on. The more affluent people are within the middle class, they will find a solution to the housing crisis, and it just pushes the problem. For that is anyone who does high school economics, you understand the principles of how these things happen. So we absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. We have all the tools to be able to solve these things. But I think that narrowing down to those 2 or 3 points about what we need to is quite achievable. I mean, I'm quite optimistic about the future, and but realistic as well. Realistic about how challenging the big macro issues for our country and for the island that Scotland is part of are, but they are all resolvable. And there's great, if you just get that ego set aside.
I remember saying to Stephen 20 years ago, before he was a reformed politician,
recovering politician.
Yeah, he's recovering politician. that I always felt, because I love my housing analogies, I always felt
a bit reformed politician. That might have connotation. I think we'll use the word recovering.
I always felt Britain was like an old house where politicians of different parties were coming in, and it needed rewired and replumbed, but what they were doing was just changing the sockets on the walls, so it looked as though it had been refurbished. But I remember saying to Stephen, but the longer you do that, the closer you get to the point where the wiring just breaks and the plumbing just breaks. And I feel that's sort of where we've got to 20 years later, that we've been fiddling with the sockets and never fixed the plumbing and the heating. So we now are at that huge stage. You talked about people, there is a lot of money there, but not the huge dam breaking money that people are talking about. So that's one side. We need to get the money in, and we're in billions just to fix the affordable housing waiting list, tens of billions. But the other aspect is we could have all the money in the world, and this is one, again, your speciality at CBRE. But if we don't have the deliverability in terms of the planners and the planning legislation, doesn't matter. That money's just going to sit in the bank or in somebody's shares.
And as you've said, the physical infrastructure.
Yeah,
as well.
so how does that get tackled? How do we tackle the planning side of things? And putting, again, Edinburgh, good example, 35% affordable housing is one thing. The immediate thought that goes through my head is, even if you do hit the big numbers, where are you sticking them? Because Edinburgh's not got loads of green space everywhere. Our jobs are all concentrated in Glasgow and Edinburgh, and there's not a vast array of land in those places. So how do we free up space? What do we need to do?
Well, it's been an interesting couple of weeks in the case of Edinburgh. I mean, yesterday Crosswinds got consented unanimously, 3,000 homes. The week before, or 2 weeks before, I can't remember, Westtown, 7,000 homes. So shout out to the new CEO of Edinburgh Council, Paul Lawrence, Head of Planning, David Given, David Cooper, City of Edinburgh Council. Well done them. I mean, I think they can sit back and say, we've done our bit. We've just consented 10,000 homes in that case.
Yeah.
But that's actually a really good example of or underscore to the point I was making earlier. So we've got the consent, really good development partners. The urban expansion or the expansion of Edinburgh, but who's paying for the infrastructure? I don't know what the numbers are to create service plots for development, but I mean, big would be. we can all land in that conclusion in a heartbeat. So there's a specific example that I think in the case of Westtown, 2,000, maybe 2,500 of those consented units are affordable, but until that infrastructure funding piece is unlocked, we could be a while's waiting. Now, knowing the parties involved there and with the benefit of proactive people in the City of Edinburgh Council, one hopes that will reach a reasonably. I mean, this is a 200-acre site, so we've all been round the block. That won't be developed out in 18 months. This is a long time, but given the parties involved, one can be hopeful. But as to the wider point, the unhelpful answer is I don't know specifically, but I remain confident and upbeat that with the benefit of a positive attitude and a meeting of minds and the experience we have indigenously, the quality of the people, we've got to be able to unlock it. We've got to.
And we need to. Yeah. So got to be able to, and we need to.
I mean, it's easy for me to get emotional about it. I mean, we can move on from big, large-scale housing sites and look at our town centre. I mean, is there any grown-up in the room who's saying, they've never looked so great? It's hard yards. And I'm speaking in broad strokes before I get somebody phoning up and saying, our town's fantastic. I'm speaking in broad strokes. It's grim, and yet you speak to every local authority whose ambition is laudable. We want to bring people back into our town centres living. Makes sense. Great. It's the vibrancy of a town centre from its people. But again, sorry to drone on about the same point, it's viability. Only yesterday I was speaking to a residential developer, and for reasons I can't remember, we tumbled into a discussion about when was the last time there was new build residential development in Glasgow city centre. I'm not saying this is correct, but between us we agreed it was the Landsec apartments in Buchanan Street in 2011.
The Buchanan Gardens.
There's a reason why there's not been any since, and there is now none currently on site.
And that'd be 14 years ago.
It's not viable. That's Glasgow. Let's take that discussion to insert name of any town. Perth, Kirkcaldy, Kilmarnock. These are big issues that need addressing if for the greater good of our Scottish communities.
One area that's bucking the trend, perhaps
Falkirk, great story recently, and I take my hat off. If cities had a share price, Dundee would be up there.
Dundee as well, of course. Yeah.
John Alexander, who we know is no longer there.
Yeah.
He deserves great credit.
Yeah.
Dundee's story is brilliant.
So what's Dundee been doing right?
Well, what Dundee's been doing, like, in my view, is it had strong, good leadership with a vision. And it's terribly easy, and I don't mean to be cliche, to drop into the Manchester Bernstein point.
Yeah.
But it's similar. Mm-hmm. Strong leadership, clarity of vision, people behind him, all on the same page. Robin Presswood, you went up there. It didn't matter if you were somebody talking about investing £1 billion or you were Chris Dougray, a real estate advisor. Let me take you through our vision for the city. I've got a 30-slide presentation. Hard not to be impressed. And guess what? They've done great.
Mm-hmm. It's an element of his marketing as well.
Oh, John Alexander, the world's busiest guy on LinkedIn when he was at the council. Yeah. And it was brilliant. And so was Robin Presswood. And Robin still is. And yeah, definitely. The message and language and optimistic tone was unmistakable. And as you say, Falkirk, they had the news recently about the further investment they've attracted in.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
And towns like Falkirk, I like Falkirk just to be, it's not a Falkirk thing. But you know, I mean, towns like that, your small to medium-sized Scottish town, they need help.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there was a kind of joined-upness approach as well in Dundee, wasn't there? Because they absolutely recognised some years ago that getting everything right, so that's a wider infrastructure. So doing something with the waterfront, you know, getting the branding of the V&A, and we're getting the V&A there as well. You know, footfall.
But the template was there with Michael Kelly in Glasgow in the 80s, in terms of creating, just transforming a city that is, as you and I were growing up, the tenements were as black as your top. Just transforming. Sometimes it's the superficial stuff you need to do to bring everybody along and create that narrative of we're going somewhere, we're doing something. And having that positive, as you talked about Dundee, having that positive story to tell about a vision that brings everybody along. I sometimes get the impression that, and I understand why, but some of our other towns are sitting there with a bit of a woe is me. We used to be a player, you know. I used to be a contender to give the quote. But that's the problem. They're sitting there saying we used to be something, and now we're not, and feeling a bit sorry for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, that comment absolutely resonates with me. There's a sclerotic nature of the tone, which, you know, I think all of us, it's not a real estate thing. Post-COVID, post-global financial crisis, these series of black swan events, we're in a new world. You know, we need to be much more open to what's going on.
Yeah.
If I can tell you one little anecdote, which is a good example, and I must say gives great credit to Glasgow Council. And full disclosure, I was involved in this transaction with the Social Hub in Candlerig.
Oh, yes.
Social Hub in Candlerig was actually founded by a Scottish guy, Charlie McGregor, and really difficult one for a local authority to get their heads around. We're a hybrid hospitality business. You can see what?
Yeah.
Sort of student, sort of hotel, sort of co-living. 25 to 50,000 square feet of offices for young entrepreneurs, open to the public. Oh yeah. You know, where does that fit in the planning use classes order? Anyway, the Glasgow Council got it. And there it sits now. And it's an amazing thing to see, not because of its, I'm sure the Social Hub would be happy that it's commercially successful. But, you know, Alistair Gunn at Strathclyde Innovation District, he uses their auditorium. Members of the public walk in for a beer. They have free lectures. The office is really interesting little point. I think they've got, somebody will correct me, I think they've got 30,000 square feet of offices for small businesses. It was almost pre-let before they opened.
Wow.
I mean, that's a good thing. And the point is, that was their first in the UK. This is a pan-European business that GIC paid €2 billion for. Glasgow should be proud. And it's a good example, in my view, of a local authority. Anne-Marie at the time.
Yep, it was.
Got it. Do you know what? We'll roll the dice. And it was a bit of rolling the dice.
Yeah, and it looks good as well.
And that's exciting. How long was that vacant?
Yeah, oh God.
20 years? 30 years?
It must be 30 years, because I'm out of the council 15 years ago, and I remember, even before I was the leader of the council, when I had the development brief in the cabinet, that we were meeting people about that site, so it's 30 years. But it's also a good example of Glasgow should be marketing that and talking about it being the first in the UK and talking about the ability to deliver mixed use sites. So, it should be...
That's a big... I totally agree with that. That's a real feather in their cap.
Totally. As I say, it looks good as well. And because of that mixed use, this is another aspect of infrastructure that's not always immediately recognisable, that it's now benefiting wider infrastructure round about, the obvious one like the public realm, but its contribution to just taking what had become a tired, not just because of the vacant site, but a generally tired merchant city up that wee bit as well, and what it can do for wider infrastructure. CBRE have been changing their infrastructure recently. As a
beautiful segue there, Stephen. We've done this before.
Some interesting things have been happening that's not lost, I think, in people in the industry. If you want to tell us a wee bit about that?
Thank you. Yeah, well, we've we patiently had been seeking the right team to join us from the planning consultancy point of view, and I'm delighted to say that the 14 members are now onboarded, and they're top quality folks led by Kate Donald and Colin Smith. Some of the listeners may know the team. So it gives us a completely new and fresh and important platform in the CBRE Scottish business. And an important point to make, I make the point about Scotland there quite deliberately, because we have colleagues, rest of the UK, who are very busy. And planning, well, I think we all know, all your listeners will know what a planning consultant is, and I'm not trying to redefine that, but the nuance which my new colleagues and I and colleagues down south would layer over the base definition, I suppose, is that we're heavily involved in the economic case for planning, understanding that point about funding. What am I trying to say? We're trying to take planning beyond the pen and paper exercise. What's actually deliverable? What works? So it's exciting. It's exciting, I hope, for our new colleagues working in CBRE, a global business, and it's certainly exciting for me. I'm deeply involved with them and my then existing colleagues in the Scottish business. So thank you for allowing me the opportunity to mention that. But yeah, it's in a market where we're all advisors. It's tough.
Yeah,
it's tough. I mean, this is as tough a spell as I can remember. But
you're a big global business, and the reason I wanted to mention it is because often, whether it's in podcasts or things we'll go to within our respective businesses and the industry we've an interest in, it's easy to get focused on the doom and gloom side, the big macro stuff we can't change. What's the Scottish Government doing right, wrong, which councils work best, all of these things. But you're a big global business, and that must be a vote of confidence in the future of Scotland and in the market. The more importantly, the people that have endorsed these decisions above you from outside Scotland are prepared to put their weight behind it. So, I mean, I think it's a really cheery story about the outlook for our sector.
It's not just the planners. We're taking on a very senior chap in our sheds team. I don't want to violate CBRE state secrets, but, you can expect further news on recruitment in New Year. And that does make us different from other firms this isn't a we're better than them thing. It's just we are investing in our people and new people. I think what's interesting for me, even an old dog like me, but especially for young people, that international piece and the ability to understand, things we are doing with the mayor of Manhattan. It's a bit exotic, and it's not just the appeal of the exotic. It's interesting to see how they're dealing with vacant offices. it's interesting to understand that for all the chat, let's turn offices into residential. The evidence from Manhattan is that around only 7% of the existing office stock can be converted. Well, you need that data. Otherwise, it's very easy just to keep beating the drum.
Exactly.
And you're in an echo chamber. Convert offices to resi. Well, wait a minute. We've got evidence that it's not just that easy.
Yeah.
Let's work off data. And I have to say, if there's one, well, there's many things CBRE are excellent at, but they have a ton of data.
Right.
And I think increasingly in a sophisticated real estate world, decisions are made on data.
Yeah. And you have that international resource. And of course, trends are consistent across the world. Trends are in Manhattan or elsewhere are relevant to us here in Scotland. I think we're moving towards the end of the podcast, and we kind of like to end on kind of lighter notes. I don't know if Brian, something you're bursting to take us into that.
Yes,
that later. I don't know when this will go out.
Well, so I was just, as we were talking, I was thinking about dates for when this will go out. So for the listener, this part's boring. It will probably be the first week in New Year, I think, would be the time to put it out, which is then an opportune question to ask you, getting back to Stephen's point about the positivity of going forward. One of the things anecdotally that I've noticed, I'm in a board of a charitable office space where this office is. Our occupancy rate has rocketed this year. I was with Scottish Power. I was speaking to people in Scottish Power this week, and they're noticing more people working in their offices, getting a bit bored with the remote working. So I'm going to ask you two things.
Come on.
What is the trend that you see in terms of office occupancy? Because that will deal with the vacant city centres that we've been talking about in town centres. And just where do you see the housing market going in 2025, since this will be out at the beginning of 2025? So double whammy of two questions. The longer term in occupancy and the short term of the housing market in 2025.
Well, the first one, crikey, I could come back and fill a podcast and talking about the office market. That's something I've never seen before in my career, what's happening just now.
Interesting.
Specifically on your question, there is an increasing return to the office.
Yeah.
Again, I could go and get the data because we have it. I think in the UK it's hovering around 3.5 days a week now. I think what's quite interesting...
Sorry to interrupt, that was exactly what, probably telling tales out of school here, that's exactly the ratio that Scottish Power have now got. 3.5 days a week in, 2.5 days a week out is their averaging.
If I can just give you a quick bit of international chat, we've done a lot of research on this as a firm. So people won't be able to see me, I don't suppose, but listening. So on the left-hand side of my page...
No, they can, there's a...
So on the left-hand side of my page is Silicon Valley, peace and love, work where you want, when you want. Hey, all's well. On the right-hand side is Goldman Sachs. It's 5 days a week. And if you don't like it...
Tough.
So, and in the middle is 3, 4, a mix. Which side of the page has the highest attrition of staff?
The Silicon Valley, do what you want, when you want.
Because people have no emotional attachment to their firm. And they'll move down the road for $1. And the second highest is 5 days a week.
I also
this is probably, it feels like common sense the way I'm saying it. And we're landing in a middle ground where that hybrid arrangement is becoming the common one.
Well, I often make the point, cities and towns have evolved. Why? Because humans like to congregate together. And yet we seem to think in a workplace they don't.
Exactly.
I say they do. People like working together. They don't like being on their own. And how many, we've all worked in an environment where you've had the difficult person on the phone. What you want to do in the next 2 minutes is vent to your colleague about that conversation you've just had.
Well, we've all been that soldier.
No question. So I said we like to finish on a lighter note.
Okay.
The
housing bill. I think we're in... The dry response is I think we're in for a period of stabilisation.
Yeah.
I think we'll be... I'm not expecting massive changes, but my optimistic final note is we have all the best people. who are pointing in the same direction. And I believe in the power of the human condition. We all want the best for the country, so I certainly do.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on, and for the listener, the viewer, to start 2025 on, and I think we'll adopt it,
Yep.
Housing Podcast, and we'll think about all the best people.
Yes.
Looking forward for Scotland in 2025, and all the best people will get on this podcast.
Exactly.
We're kicking off with the first one.
Exactly.
in
The best person at
2025.
CBRE is on the podcast
Yeah.
to start with.
Thanks very much.
Thanks
Thanks very much, Chris. Thanks for listening to the Scottish Housing Podcast with Stephen Purcell and me, Brian Gilmore. To ensure you don't miss an episode, please follow us and subscribe wherever you pick up your podcasts. To find out more about the presenters, go to scottishhousingpod.com, and to get all the latest information about forthcoming guests and new episodes, follow us on social media at Scottish Housing Pod.